Look at this photograph carefully. Really look at it. What you see is an elegant woman in a black silk dress standing behind a young boy seated in an ornate chair. They're in what appears to be a photography studio in Boston, and everything seems perfectly normal for 1881. The boy wears a crisp white shirt with a pressed collar, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The woman's hands rest gently on his shoulders. They both stare directly at the camera with that serious expression people had in old photographs because they had to sit completely still for so long. But here's what nobody knew until almost 60 years later. That boy had been dead for nearly 2 weeks. And the woman standing behind him wasn't his mother. She was a complete stranger who had stolen his body from a funeral home in Philadelphia, traveled over 300 miles with it hidden in a steamer trunk, and paid a photographer an absolute fortune to create this single portrait. This is the true story of Sarah Hartwell and the photograph that launched one of the most disturbing investigations in American history, a case that remained unsolved for decades and revealed secrets that still make investigators uncomfortable today. In the 1880s, death was everywhere in America. Tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and dozens of other diseases we barely think about now were killing people constantly, especially children. It wasn't unusual for families to lose 2 or 3 kids before they reached adulthood. And because of this, Americans developed some pretty intense rituals around death. One of the most common was post-mortem photography. Families would hire photographers to take pictures of their deceased loved ones, often posed to look like they were just sleeping or even standing upright with their eyes open. It sounds creepy to us now, but back then it made perfect sense. Photography was expensive, and for many families, that post-mortem photo would be the only image they'd ever have of their child or parent or sibling. Photographers became experts at making the dead look alive. They'd use metal stands hidden behind the body to keep it upright. They'd paint realistic-looking eyes onto the closed eyelids. They'd use makeup to hide the pale gray color of death. Some photographers even specialized in this type of work, advertising their services specifically for bereaved families. It was considered a final gift of love, a way to remember someone exactly as they were. Sarah Hartwell lived alone in a boarding house on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. She was 42 years old in 1881, unmarried, and worked as a music teacher for wealthy families in the city. According to everyone who knew her, she was quiet, respectable, and kept to herself. She attended church every Sunday at the Second Presbyterian Church on Walnut Street, wore conservative dark dresses, and had lived in the same small room for 8 years. Her landlady, Mrs. Catherine Morrison, later told police that Sarah was the perfect tenant. She paid her rent on time every month, never caused trouble, and rarely had visitors. The only unusual thing about her was that she sometimes talked about her son, a boy named Thomas who she said was away at school in New York. Mrs. Morrison thought it was a bit odd that she never saw the boy during holidays or summer break, but Sarah always had explanations. He was staying with relatives, or he'd gotten a special opportunity to study with a particular teacher, or he was traveling with a friend's family. It all seemed reasonable enough. In March 1881, an 8-year-old boy named Timothy Marsh died of scarlet fever in Philadelphia. He was the son of William and Eleanor Marsh, a middle-class couple who owned a dry goods store near Independence Hall. Timothy had been sick for about a week before he died, and his parents were absolutely devastated. He was their only child. They'd tried for years to have more children but never could. Timothy was everything to them. The funeral was held at Henderson & Sons Funeral Home on South Street, one of the most respected establishments in the city. Timothy was prepared for burial, dressed in his best suit, and placed in a small coffin lined with white satin. The viewing was scheduled for 2 days, with the burial to follow at Laurel Hill Cemetery. On the first night of the viewing, about 30 people came to pay their respects. Neighbors, friends from church, customers from the store. Everyone signed the guest book and spoke quietly with the grieving parents. One of those visitors was Sarah Hartwell. She signed her name clearly in the book, stayed for about 20 minutes, and then left. Nobody thought anything of it. People often attended viewings for families they barely knew as a sign of community support. But here's where things get strange. Sarah came back the next night. And the night after that. And during the actual funeral service. William and Eleanor Marsh later told investigators they noticed her because she seemed so affected by Timothy's death. She cried more than some of their closest friends and family members. At one point, Eleanor even went over to comfort her, thinking maybe Sarah had lost a child herself and Timothy's death was bringing back painful memories. Sarah told her through tears that yes, she'd had a son who died years ago, and seeing Timothy reminded her so much of him. Eleanor felt terrible for her and invited her to come back to their house after the burial for a small gathering. Sarah thanked her but said she couldn't make it. She had to leave town unexpectedly for work. That was the last time anyone saw Sarah Hartwell in Philadelphia for months. It was also the last time anyone saw Timothy Marsh's body. 2 nights after the funeral, the night manager at Henderson & Sons went down to the basement preparation room to check on another body that was being held there. He immediately noticed that one of the storage drawers was open. The drawer where Timothy Marsh's body should have been resting until his burial the next morning. The drawer was empty. At first, he thought maybe one of the other employees had moved the body upstairs to the chapel for some reason. But when he checked, Timothy wasn't there either. He wasn't anywhere in the funeral home. Someone had stolen an 8-year-old boy's corpse right out of the funeral home. The police were called immediately. This was one of the most disturbing crimes anyone in Philadelphia could remember. Who steals a dead child? And why? William and Eleanor Marsh were beside themselves. The violation of their son's body felt almost worse than his death. The police investigated everyone who had access to the funeral home, all the employees, the families of other deceased people being held there, anyone who might have had keys or known the layout of the building. They found nothing. Whoever took Timothy knew exactly what they were doing. They'd picked the lock on the basement door, gone straight to the right drawer, and carried out a child's body without being seen or heard. It would have required planning, knowledge, and nerve. The investigation went nowhere for weeks. Then, in early April, a photographer named James Whitmore in Boston contacted Philadelphia police with a very strange story. A woman had come to his studio on Tremont Street about 3 weeks earlier asking for a very specific type of photograph. She wanted a portrait of herself with her son, she said, but her son was extremely ill and couldn't sit up or move at all. Could Mr. Whitmore photograph them anyway? He'd done photographs of sick people before, even people who were clearly dying, so he said yes. The woman showed up 2 days later in an elegant black dress carrying what appeared to be a sleeping boy wrapped in blankets. She'd brought him in through the back entrance of the studio, explaining that she didn't want to disturb him or expose him to the cold March air more than necessary. Whitmore helped her position the boy in a chair. The child seemed completely limp, and Whitmore assumed he was unconscious from illness or medication. The woman was very particular about how everything should look. She arranged the boy's hands in his lap, tilted his head just so, and stood behind him with her hands on his shoulders. She told Whitmore she wanted to be in the photograph too, to show that she'd been there for her son during his illness. The whole session took about 40 minutes because the woman kept adjusting things. She'd move the boy's head slightly, reposition his collar, smooth down his hair. Whitmore noticed that the child never moved on his own, never opened his eyes, never even seemed to breathe, but he figured the poor kid was just heavily sedated. He'd seen plenty of sick children over the years, and this kind of stillness wasn't that unusual for someone seriously ill. What bothered him was the smell. Even with windows open, there was this sweet, heavy odor in the studio that he couldn't quite identify. The woman had explained that her son was being treated with various medicines and ointments that had strong scents, which seemed to make sense. When the session was over, the woman paid Whitmore $50 in cash, which was an absolutely enormous amount of money for a single photograph. The average portrait cost maybe $3 or $4 at most. She told him she wanted the absolute best quality work he could do, that this photograph was extremely important to her. She asked him to have it ready in 1 week and gave him an address where he could send it. Then she wrapped the boy back up in his blankets and left the same way she came in, through the back door. Whitmore developed the photograph and was actually pretty proud of how it turned out. The composition was good, the lighting was excellent, and despite the boy's stillness, the image had a certain dignity to it. He sent it to the address the woman had provided, collected his money, and forgot about the whole thing. Until he read in the newspaper about a stolen body in Philadelphia. The article described how an 8-year-old boy named Timothy Marsh had been taken from a funeral home, and there was a physical description of the child. Blonde hair, small for his age, distinguishing marks including a birthmark on his left hand. Whitmore suddenly felt sick. He pulled out his records from that session with the woman in black, found the negative, and looked at it closely for the first time since developing it. He could see the boy's left hand in the photograph, folded in his lap. And there, clearly visible, was a distinctive birthmark. He contacted the Philadelphia police the same day. When detectives showed the photograph to William and Eleanor Marsh, Eleanor fainted immediately. It was definitely Timothy. There was no question. That was their son in the picture, dressed in the suit they'd buried him in, wearing the expression he'd had in death. But the woman standing behind him, touching his shoulders with such apparent tenderness? They'd never seen her before in their lives. The police showed them names from the funeral home guest book, and eventually Eleanor recognized one. Sarah Hartwell. That was the woman who'd been so upset at the viewing, the one Eleanor had comforted. They had a name, but when police went to Sarah's boarding house on Chestnut Street, she was gone. She'd left the day after Timothy's funeral, telling Mrs. Morrison she had a family emergency in New York and wasn't sure when she'd be back. She'd paid 3 months' rent in advance and asked Mrs. Morrison to hold her room for her. That was over a month ago, and she hadn't been back since. Mrs. Morrison let the police search Sarah's room, and what they found there made everyone involved in the case deeply uncomfortable. The room was almost empty of personal belongings, just some clothes, a few books, basic toiletries. But inside a locked trunk that the police had to break open, they found something that changed everything. There were dozens of photographs, maybe 40 or 50 of them, all dating back years. They were pictures of children, boys mostly, ranging in age from about 6 to 12 years old. Different children in different clothes and different settings. Some looked like they were from the 1860s based on the style. Some looked more recent. And in many of the photographs, there was a woman. The same woman in each one, aging slightly from picture to picture, but definitely the same person. Standing behind the boys, or sitting next to them, or holding their hands. In every single photograph, the woman was Sarah Hartwell. And in every single photograph, the children were dead. You could tell if you looked closely. That particular stillness that no living child has. The way they're positioned just slightly awkwardly. The glassy quality of eyes that have been painted on. Some of the children's skin had that waxy gray tone that makeup couldn't quite hide. These were all post-mortem photographs, and Sarah was in every one of them, posing as though she belonged there, as though these dead children were hers. Police started trying to identify the children in the photographs. It took months of work, going through missing persons reports and death records from multiple cities. Boston, New York, Baltimore, Richmond, Pittsburgh. What they eventually pieced together was absolutely horrifying. At least 6 of the children in Sarah's collection had been reported as missing from funeral homes or cemeteries over the past 15 years. Different cities, different years, but always the same pattern. A child dies, the family holds a viewing or funeral, and then the body disappears before burial. Sometimes it was stolen from the funeral home like Timothy. Sometimes it was taken from the cemetery before the grave was filled. Twice, it appeared that someone had actually dug up a casket shortly after burial, though in those cases the bodies were found abandoned later. In every single case, the grieving family had no idea who would do such a thing or why. Police had never connected these incidents before because they happened in different jurisdictions over many years, but now with Sarah's photographs, the pattern was unmistakable. She'd been doing this for over a decade, traveling to different cities, attending funerals of children she didn't know, stealing their bodies, and having photographs taken with them as though they were her sons. The psychiatric experts who consulted on the case, which was a pretty new field back then, had theories. They thought Sarah had probably lost a child years ago, maybe her real son Thomas that she sometimes mentioned, and that loss had broken something in her mind. She couldn't accept that her child was gone, so she kept trying to recreate that relationship with other dead children. The photographs were proof, in her mind, that she still had a son, that she was still a mother. Every time a photograph was taken, she could pretend for a few minutes that everything was normal, that her child was there with her, even if he couldn't move or speak or breathe. It was a delusion so powerful that she'd built her entire life around it, moving from city to city, hunting for the right child, the one who looked enough like her lost son to make the fantasy work. When one photograph wasn't enough anymore, she'd do it again. And again. And again. But here's the thing that made this case even more disturbing. Police started finding gaps in the evidence. There were more photographs in Sarah's trunk than there were missing children they could identify. Maybe 10 or 12 pictures that didn't match any known disappearances. So either those children's bodies had been stolen and never reported, which seemed unlikely, or Sarah had managed to get access to children's bodies through some other means that investigators never figured out. Some detectives thought maybe she'd posed with children at their funeral viewings, bribing or manipulating photographers to let her into the frame, making it look like she was a family member. Others worried that the unidentified children might have died under suspicious circumstances, that maybe Sarah had done more than just steal bodies. There was no evidence of that, no proof she'd ever hurt anyone, but the possibility hung over the investigation like a dark cloud. Sarah Hartwell was never found. Police searched for her in every major city on the East Coast. They checked passenger lists for trains and ships. They sent her photograph to police departments across the country and even in Canada. Nothing. She vanished completely after dropping off Timothy Marsh's body in Boston. The address she'd given the photographer Whitmore turned out to be fake. The name she'd used at his studio was fake. Any trail she might have left behind disappeared into nothing. Some investigators thought she might have killed herself once she realized police were looking for her. Others believed she changed her identity completely and started over somewhere far away, maybe even out west where record-keeping was less thorough and it was easier to reinvent yourself. There were a few reported sightings over the years. A woman matching Sarah's description was supposedly seen at a child's funeral in Chicago in 1884. Another report came from San Francisco in 1887. But none of these sightings were ever confirmed, and by the 1890s, the search had basically been abandoned. Timothy Marsh's body was eventually found in a basement storage room at a boarding house in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The boarding house owner had rented the room to a woman named Mary Thompson in March 1881, and the woman had paid for 6 months in advance, saying she needed a private space to store some valuable family items. When the 6 months were up and Mary Thompson never came back, the owner finally opened the locked room to see what she'd left behind. Timothy was there, preserved with some kind of embalming chemicals and wrapped carefully in white linen, lying in a simple wooden box. The owner called police immediately, and through dental records and that distinctive birthmark, they confirmed it was the Marsh boy. His parents were able to finally bury him properly at Laurel Hill Cemetery, though by that point Eleanor Marsh was in such poor mental health that she barely understood what was happening. She'd spent the months since Timothy's death and the discovery of his body in Boston in a kind of breakdown, unable to process what someone had done to her child. William Marsh closed their store and moved them both out to Lancaster County to live with Eleanor's sister, hoping the change would help her heal. It didn't really. Eleanor died less than 2 years later, and the doctor who signed her death certificate listed the cause as melancholia and nervous exhaustion, which was their way of saying that grief had literally killed her. The photograph that James Whitmore took, the one of Sarah standing behind Timothy's body, became evidence in the case, but it was never released to the public during the investigation. It stayed in police files for decades. But in 1943, a researcher going through old unsolved cases in Philadelphia police archives came across the file and was shocked by what he found. The photograph had been filed away with all of Sarah's other pictures from her trunk, and together they created this disturbing visual record of her obsession. The researcher, whose name was Henry Caldwell, was working on a book about criminal psychology and American criminal history, and he got permission to include some information about the case in his work. That's when the story finally became public, more than 60 years after it happened. Caldwell's book included a few of the photographs, though not the one of Timothy Marsh out of respect for any surviving family members, and the case attracted attention from other researchers and historians. People started digging deeper into Sarah Hartwell's background, trying to understand who she really was and what had made her this way. What they found was fragmentary at best. Sarah had been born in 1839 in Wilmington, Delaware, to a middle-class family. Her father was a clerk and her mother died when Sarah was very young, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She'd had some education, enough to become a music teacher, and had moved to Philadelphia in her early 20s. There was a marriage record from 1862 showing that she'd married a man named Robert Hartwell, a soldier in the Union Army, but Robert had died in 1863 during the Battle of Gettysburg. That was confirmed through military records. What was harder to confirm was whether Sarah had ever actually had a son. Some records suggested she'd given birth in 1864, but there was no death certificate for a child named Thomas Hartwell, which doesn't necessarily mean anything because record-keeping back then wasn't always thorough, especially for infant and child deaths. Some researchers think Thomas might have been stillborn or died very young, before any official record was made. Others think maybe Thomas never existed at all, that Sarah had a phantom pregnancy or created an imaginary son to cope with being widowed and alone. Either way, Something happened in the mid-1860s that started Sarah on this dark path. Modern psychologists who have studied the case believe Sarah suffered from what we'd now call complicated grief disorder combined with possible delusional disorder. She fixated on her loss, whether it was a real child or an imagined one, and that fixation grew into a complete break with reality. The photographs became her way of maintaining a connection to something she'd lost or never had. Each time she posed with a dead child, she was recreating a moment of motherhood, of having her son with her. The fact that the children were dead didn't matter to her because in her mind, they weren't really gone. They were just sleeping, just still, just quiet. She could pretend for the length of a photography session that she was a mother with her child, and the photograph would give her physical proof of that reality. She could look at it whenever she wanted and remember that moment of connection, even if it was built entirely on delusion and violation. The thing that makes Sarah Hartwell's story so disturbing isn't just what she did, though that's horrible enough. It's the questions it raises about how many other people might have done similar things that we just never found out about. Post-mortem photography was so common in the late 1800s, and record-keeping was so inconsistent, that it's entirely possible other people used that practice to insert themselves into strangers' grief, to pose with dead children or adults they'd never known in life. We only know about Sarah because she got caught, because she made a mistake by going to Boston and using a photographer who later connected the dots. But how many of her photographs were taken without anyone ever questioning who she was or why she was in the frame? How many times did she stand at someone's funeral viewing, comfort a grieving mother, and then slip into a photograph as though she belonged there, with no one ever realizing she was an intruder? The Victorian era's acceptance of post-mortem photography created this weird space where the boundaries between family and stranger, between grief and obsession, could get really blurred. And Sarah Hartwell lived in that blurred space for years before anyone noticed something was wrong. Look at that photograph one more time if you can stomach it. Sarah standing behind Timothy Marsh, her hands on his shoulders, both of them staring at the camera with that serious Victorian expression. If you didn't know the story, you'd see a mother and her sick child, maybe a final portrait before the boy's death. But knowing the truth transforms that image into something else entirely. You're looking at a woman who stole a child's body from a funeral home, transported it hundreds of miles, paid a fortune to have this single photograph made, and then carefully stored that body until she was done with it. You're looking at someone so disconnected from normal human emotion and behavior that she could do all of that and see it as an act of love. And you're looking at a mystery that was never really solved. We know what Sarah did, but we don't know why, not really. We don't know what was going through her mind when she stood behind those dead children, when she arranged their hands and tilted their heads and smoothed their hair. We don't know if she believed her own delusion completely or if some part of her knew the truth and didn't care. We don't know if she felt any guilt or remorse or if she died somewhere years later still believing she'd been a mother to all those boys. And we'll never know, because Sarah Hartwell took those answers with her when she disappeared into American history, leaving behind only photographs and questions and the grief of families like the Marshes who had to live with what she'd done. The case of Sarah Hartwell and Timothy Marsh reminds us that the most unsettling mysteries aren't always about ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're about the human capacity for delusion, about what happens when love and loss twist into something unrecognizable, about the ways grief can break a person so completely that they stop seeing other people as real. Sarah Hartwell wasn't evil in the traditional sense. She didn't torture anyone, didn't cause the deaths of the children she photographed. But what she did was a profound violation, a theft of not just bodies but a family's ability to say goodbye with dignity, to give their children peaceful burials, to have closure. And that violation, carried out over and over for years, makes her story one of the most disturbing in American criminal history. If you want to hear more stories like this one, real historical cases that are stranger and darker than any fiction, make sure you're subscribed because I've got plenty more to share. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.